Hello, everyone. Welcome to a walk through short fiction editing. I'm so excited to have these lovely panelists with me here today. To kick off, we'll do intros. My name is Gabriella Etoniru. I use they, them pronouns. I'm currently the associate editor at Baffling Mag, and I'm also an MFA candidate in creative writing at Columbia University. And next, Monica, would you like to go?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Monica Louzon. I'm the acquiring editor at The Dread Machine, and I also do freelance editing and translating with quantum editing. I am also editing The Dread Machine. We're doing a couple of anthologies. We have one that we're currently editing before publication, and then another one where the submission call for Darkness Blooms, it ends on Monday. So if you have stories that are community, identity, or security themed, please send them our way.
Neil?
Hi, I'm Neil Clarke. I'm the publisher and editor of Clarke's World magazine and Forever magazine. And I also do a number of anthologies, including the Best Science Fiction of the Year series for Nightshade Books.
My name is Dave Ring, and I'm the editor and managing, publisher and managing editor over at Neon Hemlock Press, and also at Baffling Magazine. So we both acquired novellas right now, speculative novellas, working on an anthology, Unfettered Hexes, Queer Tales of Insatiable Darkness. And then over at Baffling, we do flash fiction.
And I am Julia Rios. I am the editor at Mermaids Monthly, and we publish stories about mermaids. We are open until June 12th, so if you want to send us a mermaid story, you can check out our guidelines on mermaidsmonthly.com. And I also publish some stories independently on my Patreon, which my patrons sponsor. So you can also check those out, and I'll drop some links in the chat.
Thank you all so much for doing those lovely introductions. Would like to remind our attendees that if you have any questions throughout the panel, that you can drop them in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll be checking them periodically. But to start off, I'd like to direct this question towards Monica. Where are you coming from in your editorial experience, and how did you arrive to the positions you're at? How might others also get there?
Okay, so I managed to get into editing with The Dread Machine because I sent some stories and also had some critiques about the website, and then tried to outthink my co-editor who runs the publication, because I was like, I don't know this publication. I don't know if they're legitimate, because their Dread Machine just launched in October last year. And I was like, okay, let's make sure this isn't a trap. But it's been a really good team to work with. Before that, I edited an anthology of science fiction called Catalyst Explorers and Secret Keepers, Women of Science Fiction. That was like I think it was 2016 or 2017. And then I also was the founding editor for the Journal of Science Fiction, which is an academic, peer-reviewed and open access, so it's free academic journal for nonfiction analysis and like discussions of science fiction around the world. And it's got some pretty great themed issues that they've been doing since I passed the torch over. And there's another part to your question, and I'm forgetting what it was.
How might others also get to where you were? What advice would you give?
I would say talking to editors, coming to panels like this one to get a feel for like what editors are like as people, and then also like what their personalities are, what they look for, what their common complaints are about editing, and the things they love about it, to see if that's a good fit for you. And then also like if you've got the gumption, like the drive, you can start your own publication. It's just a lot easier if you have other people to work with who are interested or have some experience with the editing process and know a bit about the publishing industry and what the people are like. I think that if you want to get involved, a good way, a good like networking and following people on Twitter as well, just to get to see what's out there, to see what the readership is like, and to get a feel for the industry. And I'll stop there. I've talked long enough, but if you want me to go further on any of it, please let me know.
Thank you. I'd like to open the same question up to the rest of the panel.
Okay, I'll go. Let's see. So 15 years ago on a Thursday night, I had no aspirations of being an editor. 24 hours later, I was in charge of a magazine. So this is not a path I recommend for others. My background is in computer science, technology, and working in education, which turned out that my career in instructional technology really worked out handy for being an editor's toolkit. I worked with a lot of different faculty in different disciplines and had to help them figure out how to explain things. It involved asking a lot of questions, which is a lot of editing. I also read short fiction almost exclusively for decades. So it's something I was very passionate about to start with. And I think and in college I had no English courses except for one. So it's, don't worry about the degrees and everything if this is the path you want to take. What I tend to recommend to people instead of my path is that they start off reading Slush somewhere. It's a great way to see what's happening behind the scenes in another publication and to expose yourself to having to be critical of work in a different way than you might if you were reviewing. You end up seeing the trends, the common mistakes, the things that you might need to look for if you're a writer. But for people who want to be editors, I tell them to keep going once it gets boring, because that's when you learn what kind of editing work you can do. Whether or not you can have an open slush pile, or whether or not you have to do by invitation solicited work, or just short period slush piles. And that's a really valuable thing to know before you get into a position where you're editing full-time or part-time.
Thank you so much, Dave. You look like you want to say something.
I was trying to psychically connect with Julia to see if they wanted to go next or not. I fell into founding a press when, so I was organizing Outright, which is an LGBTQ literary festival in Washington, D.C. And we started a chapbook competition. I just said the word competition 3 times. Chapbook competition, and the winners, we need to publish them. And I had like an interesting miscommunication with a different press, or I thought they were going to publish them, but they were not going to. And then, so then I started a press in a panic. But it worked out, and very shortly afterward began the process for putting together the first anthology that we worked on, which is Glitter and Ashes, and that sort of sprung us forward. And so closer to Neil's story than I expected initially as I began speaking. So you can just do that yourself. What's the necessity is the mother of invention, right? But I also, I think, recommend getting involved in behind the scenes, checking out ahead of time. And it's sort of like, not every employee is a good manager. Not every writer is a good editor. And it doesn't have to be a natural progression. You don't have to force that on you if that's not your goal. So.
Yeah, so I would also say it goes the other way. Not every editor is a good writer. And so I actually do see a lot of people who only want to edit and don't want to write. And that's also completely valid. So I say that as someone who likes both writing and editing and do both actively. I think choosing one or the other is a completely valid choice, and you should go where your heart is. I started editing in 2012 for Strange Horizons, and I went through a rigorous application process to become one of the senior fiction editors there. I was there until 2015. I helped transition to the next team. I edited for Uncanny for a little bit, doing poetry and reprints over there. And then I did Fireside, where I was the main editor and did everything. I've also done like some anthologies and some other guest spots and contests. I did the Banned Books Week for Cast of Wonders a couple of years ago. And then I decided to start Mermaids Monthly because it seemed like a fun thing to do. And I only wanted to do it for a year. So if you want to get to where I am, I actually have a clear, direct path for you, especially if you are a BIPOC editorial team. And that is, you can go to Mermaids Monthly, click on the menu bar drop down, click the Take the Helm button, and we are going to be open to applications for the next editorial team in June, in the second half of June. We basically want to transfer power at the beginning of 2022. Our goal is to choose someone by August and then spend all of September through December training them, letting them shadow us, helping them fund the year 2 and all of that, so that it won't be something where you have to fund it yourself, and you will have the keys to everything that we do. But I think that training is important, because if you don't know what you're doing, you can get into a lot of pitfalls with a magazine. And I mean, I did, even though I've done editing for other magazines for a long time, but there's also a big difference between being an editor and being a publisher. And often they go hand in hand, but they don't have to. If you don't want to take on the jobs of being a publisher, then you might look for other magazines that are solely hiring an editor. But if you do want to take on like starting your own thing, you've got to do all the publishing hats as well. And they include like graphic design and distribution. How are you getting it out to people? All the contracts, all the things. There's so much that goes into creating a magazine. And editing is one very important part of it, but not the only part.
Thank you for all of your responses. Okay, so you are now an editor, you're sitting in the seat, you're reading through submissions. How soon into a submission might you know if it's a hit or miss? And for the many stories that fall in between, how do you decide to address them, whether it's rejecting, requesting, revisions, maybe postponing it to a different issue, etc. And I'll ask Neil to start us off with this one.
Okay, well, it starts with the project you're doing. So I would approach an anthology differently than I would a magazine. And the big thing there is that an anthology has a limited amount of space and you can't duplicate much. You can duplicate some, but I couldn't buy 3 similar stories for an anthology, but I could for a magazine and just spread them out. So the first thing that I'm going to look for, did they follow the guidelines? That's why we write them, to give people an idea of what we're looking for, what we're not looking for, what our expectations are. So, every story that I'm reading, I read a lot of stories. We get about 1,100 stories a month. I might know on the first page, sometimes I might not know until I'm done reading the story. It's going to be different every story I open. I never know where I'm going to stop. But there are a number that I don't make it to the end. And it's in those cases, it's quite clearly because it's not going to fit my needs. The story either doesn't appeal to me, or it didn't follow the guidelines, or any number of things there. For me, a major thing is predictability. If the ending, if I saw the ending coming a mile away, I'm going to want to expect some other things to make up for that. And the other big item is consequences. You introduce a technology or a concept or whatever, and those things, they ripple out. And if you don't consider all the consequences of those things, it can trip you up later in the story. Let's see. I think for me, the most disappointing story is the one that I get all the way to the ending, and that's where they blew it. Because I've invested all this time. You've had me until the end, and either you didn't quite know how to end it, or you sort of took a shortcut that sort of let me down. And that's the part there. Most of the time, we do very few rewrite requests. I would say a handful in a month at maximum. Most of the time, the editing process will just be a few back and forths with the author. My process tends to be just ask questions, unless it's a phrasing problem where I guess that's still a question, is did you mean to say this? But a lot of it is just making sure I understand it, what their intent was, because I'm not trying to rewrite the story. I'm trying to make sure that the what's in their head is what ends up getting to the page. Somebody else want to go?
Anyone else want to share? I see Dave doing his telepathy again, but
I'll go. Okay, so in the editing process, when we receive the stories and we're reading through them, sometimes it's like, for me at least personally, I'll do like sometimes I'll do the one-page method, which is when you just read like the first page and a half of a story to see if there's a solid hook, or if there's like if the writing style is a good fit, because sometimes you can tell from the get-go that the writer hasn't done enough proofreading, or they haven't done enough like they just haven't organized themselves enough, or they haven't written things like they're not giving you the stakes for the character soon enough. But one caveat to that is that when you have stories written by people who aren't from like the American or the UK, like those writing traditions, you tend to have the plot, like those stakes and things get developed much more slowly, and sometimes it takes several pages into a story before you're like, okay, I see why I'm getting these vignettes. But if that's the case, like if it's going to take several pages for those things to happen, the writing needs to be very solid to keep going. But usually, as I'm going through submissions, I try to give the authors the benefit of the doubt. At the Dread Machine, we do anonymized submissions, so I don't know who the writer is. Sometimes if I suspect that it might be a second language situation, I'll look at the cover letter and see if they mention that they're from, or where they're from, or if they mention that they have some sort of cultural background that would like explain some of the structural choices that they've made. I agree with Neil. It's really disappointing when you get to the end of a story and the ending just falls apart, and it's like, this was so amazing. You had it, and then you didn't. And because the Dread Machine is new, initially we were trying to work with authors to get their stories to a better point. We wanted to do a lot more work with newer authors to help them get published and that sort of thing. But now we've got such a high volume of submissions that we don't have the time. And we had several instances where authors were, their work was their baby and they weren't ready for constructive critique. So we've become more selective in if we're going to be requesting revisions to a piece, we have to really we have to think that there's going to be a good chance that the author will work with us and be and because we're not trying to change we want the story to be what the author envisioned it. We're just trying to help, like our job as editors is to help get it clear. Like sometimes you have to get certain things clearer so that the readers understand. You don't have to give your readers a choice that his hair looked kind of brown or green. Sorry, those are the first two colors that came to mind. But you don't have to don't give your readers a choice on the that sort of thing. So sometimes it's just edits like that. Sometimes it's like, well, logically, why would your character do this? Because the characterization to this point has been completely opposite this choice that they just made. Can you, if you want to keep that in there, can you explain, give your readers a little bit more context for why the character chose to make that decision? Sorry, I'll pause here. I was going to say that I think the biggest thing is when you're working with works that have been translated or are from a different storytelling context, it's hard to just be like, oh, we're going to use the one-page method to go through things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on the story and how well it's written from the beginning.
I can go next.
Yeah.
So I think I'm going to be an outlier here because I I tend to at least skim to the end of everything, even the ones that aren't working for me. And I also don't ding people for typos. I don't ding people for not following any formatting guidelines, or even like, unless it's something where it's very specifically not the case that it's for our magazine. So if someone sends me something to Mermaids Monthly and it's not about mermaids at all, and it's very obviously not about mermaids at all, then like it's not going to go in Mermaids Monthly. That's an obvious no. But if it is and it's not within the guidelines, in most cases I'm still going to look at it. The different things that would take it out are like if it's too long, because Mermaids Monthly has no minimum word count. We have a maximum word count of 5,000, and the reason that's there is for budget. That's what we can afford, is the maximum is 5,000. So if you're sending me something that's over 5,000 words, then it's going to be a no. And I'm still going to be pretty lenient. Like if its story comes in at 5,100 words, I might not just auto reject it. But if I were to accept that story, the most likely thing that would happen is I'd tell the author, this is a conditional acceptance and we're going to have to get the word count down, because it has to be something that we can actually fit within our budget. I like to make barriers to entry as low as possible, because I do like to try to invite writers who maybe didn't have previous publication experience, or who maybe are coming from places that aren't the US, who aren't familiar with US publishing norms and expectations. And I also really like stories that don't necessarily follow an obvious Western structure. So I think that is a really good point that Monica brought up about how, like, if something is coming from a different storytelling tradition, the structure might not be the same. And it's good to sort of let go of your expectations of how stories work and see if you are also going to get into it, because you can appreciate writing for a lot of different reasons. And one is like a fast, tight plot, and that's just one. It's one great way to enjoy a story, but there are a lot of different ways to enjoy a story. So the answer is, when do I know? What do I do with things? How do I find out whether because I realize there are like a ton of questions that you threw out there, Gabriella. When do I know? Not until after I've read it all the way through once at least. Then I usually do know for the obvious no's that it's going to be a no, and I'll set it aside. But there are a lot of stories that I kind of end up sitting on for a little bit longer and considering further. I usually save things in a second round consideration pile and then go over those again another time and think about them. I usually let them sit for a few days, because I find that a lot of times stories that stick in my mind for a few days without me rereading them are really, that's a good sign. That's a green flag, if you will. If I've forgotten it, then I'm like, oh, okay, I forgot what this story is and I have to get back into it. But that doesn't mean it's an obvious no. It just means that on that second reading, I'm like, okay, now I'm reevaluating. Like, this didn't stick with me the first time. Why was that? So I ask myself a lot of questions while I'm reading. And then if I love something, if there's something that I love at the core, if I read a story and the ending doesn't land, I agree with Monica and Neil. That is super disappointing. But if I love the story up until the ending, I might then send a revise and resubmit note to the author. Or I might, if I can see an obvious way that I would fix it, I might even send a conditional acceptance and say, hey, I love this story, but the ending isn't working. Are you willing to work with me on this? And like, here's a possible solution I could see. If this works for you, let me know. And then if the author is on board, I always want to make sure that it's a story that the author feels good about telling. So it's 100% their choice, and no hard feelings if you say no. But if you say yes, then great, we're in business. We can maybe actually work on it. And I have actually worked with authors who have done major structural edits or have turned in things that were very grammatically incorrect in the first draft, because they're dyslexic, or they're coming from a different culture, or they're very young. Some of the people that I've worked with are teenagers, and this is the first time they've submitted at all. And I think that's wonderful, even if I still am going to reject 99.9% of them.
I think I lean towards what Julie was saying there. by and large. I think the example of the story that works really well until the end, but then it sort of falls apart. That is my favorite R&R to send, because it feels it's easier than the what's wrong with this story feeling, which sometimes also happens. You're like, a lot of the ingredients here are great, and like I love the concept. It's about a thing I love, but why isn't it working? Like that's harder to even consider sending an R&R because you're not sure what it is that you'd fix, or which parts you'd go in with the scalpel. And I tend to not think of myself as like the authority of authorities as well. It's like a lot of times I feel like it probably just doesn't work for me, or maybe it doesn't work for my project. It's so much easier when it's a specific anthology vibe, right? Because it's like, I love this, but it doesn't quite nail the vibe. And then you can, gush when you say no about it, and just be like, I'm sorry. I love this piece. It just isn't quite right. Whereas with Baffling or other projects like that, where it's, it's a magazine that's unthemed, like those sometimes are harder because you're just like, I do like a lot. There's a lot to love here. But that's also why I don't really tend to send personal rejections, because I actually don't think my reason for not liking it is necessarily that useful, because it could just be like a tone mismatch or something like that. For green flags, like especially when I'm like reading for Slush, I mean, I love some gimmicks, y'all. Like when people come in with like unusual forms, or like your structuring kind of jumps off the page, like I love reading that, and it gets me excited to read something. And you can see that with like our most recent issue of Baffling. Like there's a bunch of stories with like interesting structure that like just like if you were in a plane, you'd see it from that far away, like the way that they're structuring the story. So that can be a green flag. And then it's always nice when, as an editor, you're reading something. This is not useful advice. I apologize in advance. But when you're reading something as an editor and you forget sort of why you're reading it, like, oh, I'm reading this to assess it for inclusion in my magazine. And then you forget because you're just like, this is so good. So figuring out that, like when you have that writing that sizzles, like the editors do kind of have that fan person reaction as well, and sort of makes you forget. And my favorite story that I just read for Unfettered Hexes gave me that feeling, and then I couldn't accept it because it didn't nail the tone. Like this is the saddest email that I had to send, and it wasn't like an R&R situation. It just wasn't right for my Queer Witch anthology, But so. Poor editors is what I'm trying to say, I guess.
I think you brought up an important point with the personal rejections, because ideally I would send a personal rejection for every story, but sometimes it's like, this is just a matter of personal preference, or it doesn't necessarily fit the vibe. But also sometimes when I do send personal rejections, I try to make sure it's like, okay, here are specific things that didn't work for us that you could action if you were to go revise, or if you were to have enough people tell you the same thing when you get rejections elsewhere from your writing people, then you can be like, okay, here's something that this one editor thought I might be able to work on with my story to make it stronger.
I feel like a lot of us have the story of like the inexpert editorial advice, possibly in the guise of an R&R, that you then tried to fix, and then when you sent it back, it didn't work. And you're like, but I did what you said. And that's, I don't know, for me, like I just want to avoid that for other people. So unless I have a really clear pathway where like I know if I fix XYZ, or sorry, if the writer fixes XYZ, that it's a surefire hit, I tend to not want to send back an R&R because I don't really have the blueprint for how it would work.
Yeah, I will say it's very rare. Like I don't do it very often. So if you've received one from me, you're in the very extreme minority.
Thank you all so much. Sorry to cut you off there, Julia. For our editor-writer duo humans who do a little bit of both, how has your experience editing informed your writing process? And I'll let Dave start that one.
I mean, I sort of was talking about that a little bit there. Like the submission rejection process has become a lot less painful from being on the other side of the table. It's like I really take few rejections personally, and actually that's a good point, except for inappropriate personals. Where at this point I know how easy it is to not write an inappropriate personal. Like you just don't comment on certain parts of the story, and it's pretty safe. So that's the only part that I think in particular has been worse is is now that I know how to send a decent rejection, when I get them, I'm like, you just had to not get into some of those reasons. And like, if it's like too personal or too subjective or too idiosyncratic of a reason for saying no, I don't tell them. Like, that's not useful. And then otherwise, just slush reading lots of submissions, seeing lots of shapes of stories and seeing which ones thrill you, which ones don't. That's just been personally really helpful for me.
I will chime in with that. I definitely have found that slush reading gives me an appreciation for why my story probably got passed over in favor of another story that the magazine published later. Or looking at the slushes that I receive or the stories that people send in, I can see certain techniques that are used that seem to be like at a certain, everyone tries at a certain point in their writing career when they're getting started. They're like, oh, this is novel to me, so I'm going to throw it in here. But what you as a writer may not realize is that the editor is seeing a whole bunch of people doing the exact same thing. And so you have to like find ways to make your plot more compelling or your prose more interesting. Like you have to develop your style. And so I guess it's been interesting because I have a story that I wrote at this point. It's probably been like 6 years ago. And it's on like 44 rejections, a couple of personals. And it had Galaxy's Edge before Mike Resnick died. It was being held there. And I was so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, I may actually have it. Because it fit the vibe that that one reader, that editor was looking for. But I know, like, I'm at the point where, because of the slushes I've been reading, I know that what I really need to do, me as a writer, is sit down and handwrite it out and incorporate some of the, like, I've tried to go through every so often, gather all the feedback I've gotten in my rejections. And then but like what I need to do at this point for the story is sit down and handwrite it on a piece of paper, because I think that will, as I'm writing it handwritten, a lot of things will fall together. The editing process also has been good for me when I'm making revisions. It's made it a lot easier for me to increase the quality of the story's first draft that I send out to people, or like the first draft that the editors that are seeing my work. I'm getting a lot more personal rejections the first time I send a new story out, rather than having to do a bunch of revisions first. So I think in that way, I've been learning from the slush reading and the editing process.
I think for me, I think I'm the only other writer editor here because Neil doesn't write. I think for me, definitely I agree with Monica that yes, it sort of tightened my writing. I know that there are some things that I learned as sort of like writing advice from craft books and classes when I was starting out before I edited, that I kind of thought I understood, but didn't really understand until I'd actually been on the other side of it and seen multiple times. So I think just like really you can be told multiple times that editors see the same things over and over again, or see patterns, or experience like knowing whether a story will work on the first page or something like that. You can be told that, but you might not actually really internalize it until you've experienced it over and over again. And when you've read a lot of stories and you've seen, like, even though I skim at least to the end of every story, a lot of times I have a sense on page one whether I'm initially hooked or not. And that doesn't always carry through, but like a lot of times it does. So I certainly can't fault any editors who are like, I don't have time to like see whether this story has some hidden gems in it. I know on page one I'm not interested, so I'm just not going to keep reading. Like, that is a legit and valid way to edit. And I think that you can't really understand how much you will feel that until you have 1,000 stories that you have to read before next month. And then you're like, oh, I actually have read 900 stories that have slow pacing and I'm not into it. You'll learn what works for you, and you'll learn what kinds of things excite you more. So I think like I had a lot more problems with figuring out how plots could work before I started editing. And now I have a little bit more of a grasp on structure, and that helps with making that first draft that an editor might like a little bit more.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We do have a question from the chat, which says, have any of you considered a short list of archetypal stories for your magazine, say from prior issues, as a sort of existential guideline supplement? And I will let whoever wants to take that one lead off.
I think at the Dread Machine we've talked about doing that, and I know we do have several stories that are free to read because we want people to be able to see what sort of stuff we publish, but we don't have like a page on our guidelines. It's like, here are some examples of stories, because I think one thing we don't want is for everyone to try and emulate like 5 or 10 different stories. Like, we want you to surprise us. Like, the best stories are the ones that, like, I think it was Dave said, that were unpredictable. Like, those are the ones that we love. And I think I think the best we've been able to do at this point on that front, besides having some of the stories for free, has been we've added a hard pass list, I forget what we call the second category, and then the stuff that we don't see enough of, the stuff that we try to have, like, here's where our appetite is, here's stuff we're seeing a lot of, and then here's stuff where it's going to be a really hard sell if you want us to try and get that published.
So in our case, we do the hard sell list, and that's because we think that's the only part that's going to be helpful. Because if we gave you a list of, like, all our stories are online, 15 years worth of back catalog, you can read any of them, but we don't want you writing a Clarke's World story. We want you writing your story, and as far as I'm concerned, what we're looking for is a continuously moving target based on everything I've ever read. So I don't want to see the same thing over and over and again. I get bored way too easily. So if I put out a list of things that we liked, I'm too worried that, and some past experience seems to lead this to be true, that's what we would be those same stories over and over. And then the slush pile would become tedious. Even if I was looking for, say I was looking for time travel stories, that's all I would get. And then I would be sick of time travel stories by the end of the month. So that list would have to be constantly changing, be a lot of upkeep, and counterproductive to what we're doing. We want your imagination, not ours.
It is cool when, like, a certain publication ends up having, like, and I should stop using the word vibe, y'all. It's like, I should stop. But like just think of, like, the way, like, the phrase, like, a shimmer story was, like, a thing for, and I still think sometimes read a story, but, like, that's like a shimmer story. And, like, that's a cool quality to have, particularly when it is when it's not static, like it has, like, room for interpretation within it. So I'm not gonna lie, if there was, like, something that became known as, like, that's like a baffling story, like, I wouldn't be sad about it. But I think, like Neil said, like, if it was too pigeonholed, then that also takes the magic out. And even, like, when you do edit something that has a theme, like a themed anthology, the best stories often are the ones that push the theme in really unexpected ways. So I don't know that it's too, I don't know that it's too useful to point to a particular story in this. I hate always never statements. So I'm like, what is the case where I would like that? And I'm having a hard time, but I don't know.
I think the closest I've done to this is when I've been with magazines that have been nominated for a Hugo Award, and then we have to come up with something that goes into the Hugo packet. And the question is always, do you just put one issue in there, or do you try to collect a sampling of your year? And what I've usually done with that is try to choose a few different things at different lengths and different styles from the whole year to give anyone who's completely unfamiliar with the venue, who's reading that Hugo packet, which is just sent out to all the Hugo voters, if this is their first introduction to the magazine, to give them a sampler of the magazine. But that is a very different purpose. That is for specifically the Hugo voters to look at that year's content. So that's a very different from trying to like put together something for someone who's going to submit. And I think when I'm thinking about it as someone who's a submitter, I don't have a specific sampling that I want you to read, because I want you to just tell me your story. And if you have the time to read something from the magazine first, great. People always recommend reading the magazines that you're submitting to make sure you know kind of what they're publishing and whether you want to be in them. For me personally, I would want to read them just to know for sure whether that's the kind of company I want to be in. Because what if I submit just sight unseen and it turns out this magazine has like stories that I don't like at all, and then my story, I'm not going to be super proud about that in the end. So that for me is the most important reason to read any magazine you're thinking of submitting to. But I would say, like, you know, I don't think that, I think that I agree with Neil. It's not a particularly useful metric. If you're submitting and you're wondering, it's always good to go check out a few stories and just choose them at random and see what you think. But also, you know, go with the stories that you want to tell. And remember that, especially if it's something that you're doing that's on a specific trope, whether that is mermaids because we're Mermaids Monthly, or whether it's like robots because Neil Clarke is known for loving robots, you probably, the first couple of things that you think of, like the first thing you think of has been done a million times, but then the second thing you think of has also been done a million times. And the third thing you think of that's a little bit weirder than that might still have been done a million times. So like take the time to go down into like a rabbit hole of like, but what if something completely different? And then think about the things that are important to you and mash it all up into a story. And those are the best stories.
We've been finding that with the Dread Machine that we have there's certain we tend to have a lot of stories about motherhood, and it's not intentional. It's just people have been sending us really interesting speculative stories about motherhood, or in different aspects of like childbirth. And it has been like, we did not set out for this, but now we're like, you know, maybe we'll pull together, like, as we have more stories that seem to be like sharing similar characteristics or themes, maybe we'll pull those together into like standalone issues, or tags, so that people can find them easily. They're like, oh, I want this, but I don't want to read the same thing. We have like, it's just been very interesting to see how people treat these things differently. That's the one that we've talked about the most, because it became pretty apparent early on in the magazine that was something that the editorial team seems to we tend to get some really interesting stories that we weren't expecting. We're like, we're not going to publish only motherhood stories, and then it's like, well, we have this really amazing story, and it fits like what we're looking for, and it's really well written, and we can space it out and do it later in the year, so it's not back to back.
Thank you. We have a little less than 10 minutes left. I'm going to lead us into our final question, and then we can do outros if that works for everyone, which is, how do you understand your role as an editor, and how do you see short fiction editing evolving over the next few years? And I'll let Julia start us off on that one.
How do I see my role as an editor? I think I agree with Neil and Monica, who earlier mentioned wanting to try to make sure that they're clarifying the story and helping the author tell the best version of the story that they can. That is their story. So my goal is always not to change it or impose too much of my will upon it, but more to help the author polish it and make it the best version of the story that they're really trying to tell. and my job is to kind of help bring a little bit of clarity or just make sure that it's there. And sometimes just to find shiny things that I like and share them with people and know that it's always just going to be a tiny subset of all the awesome stuff that's out there. But this is a subset of stuff that sort of like beachcombing, when you're like walking along and you're like, hey, I found a pretty shell. I found a piece of sea glass. These are the ones that I found, and there are thousands of other awesome ones out there. And if you were combing the beach, you might find different ones, but these are the ones that I found. So let's all admire them for a moment. I think that's how I see my role as an editor. I also think something that I take very seriously on a more serious note is representation. So one of the things that I'm always looking at very carefully in anything I edit is the balance of the kinds of voices that I am selecting it to boost, because anything I do is choosing to highlight specific voices. And I want to make sure that I'm not just choosing the loudest ones that always get chosen, whether that means already published and celebrated authors. I do love some stories by them, and I'm certainly not going to say I never publish them, but I don't want that to be the only thing I publish. I want to encourage new spaces for new people and for people who have been either historically or in current times underrepresented and oppressed to have that voice out there. And I think that's really important. And that's where a lot of when I was talking about like trying to lower the barrier to entry, like I want to make sure that I am giving people who might get passed over in a typical publishing scenario the chance to get their voices heard and to be seen. And I know that that still means I'm going to reject most of them. Even when I try to do that, I'm still rejecting tons of people, and publishing is brutal and you're just going to get rejected over and over again. But I do care about trying to make sure that I'm imposing some balance on my work.
Just super briefly, I think that for someone who's like so into vibe, you also have to like be mindful of what, if your preconceived ideas about what a vibe is, like, is that ruling people out? So similar to what Julia was saying, it's like how much of my like vision or what I'm looking for, like by its like, are there structural things that then aren't going to appeal to me because of how I'm approaching the body of work. So I just try to think about that for each project, and that's different for an ongoing magazine versus a themed anthology, and you just have to reposition your headspace in those moments. And yeah, even like line edits, just I always like, for instance, like line editing dialogue, and for folks who have like an accent or a dialect that isn't yours, like doing that really thoughtfully and creating space for the person to be like, actually, that's not right, what you're suggesting. So just trying to position myself really softly in that space, so that I'm not like messing with people's voice. I think I talk about that too a lot, is like, I'm not interested in how I would tell this story. I'm interested in how you would tell that story.
So I think I'm going to flip it around and start from what's evolving. And I think short fiction, by its nature, the nature of the whole ecosystem, is constantly evolving. We have new authors come in. Some of them do extremely well, get awards or published elsewhere, and then suddenly they're solicited or working on a novel, and we never see them again. So that makes room for somebody new to come in. And that constant churn of new people coming in makes it a very interesting place to work. A friend of mine once described it a lot like being at school, watching the students come through. But I hate to say that they're graduating and going on to novels, because it's not any better, it's just different. But I think for me, I think one of the important aspects of how my job has changed over the years is I've become much more aware of the fact that as an online publication, we are international. Our readership is international. We need to be, and our that our submissions pile or slush pile should reflect that as well. So we've had to make a lot of efforts to help people realize they're welcome in short fiction community, particularly our slush pile, because the number one question I get in email from new authors, from foreign authors, from outside the US is, am I allowed to submit? And that means that historically we've set up a culture in short fiction that hasn't exactly been welcoming. And as an editor of a current magazine, it's my responsibility to help undo some of that damage.
Thank you all so much for your time today. To our attendees, thank you for joining us. I think we have like a minute left if you want to do outros, but also every link is going to be in the chat for those who have time and are interested in continuing the conversation. I also believe our lovely tech human will be linking the Discord server link as well.
A real quick plug for people from marginalized populations or people who are underrepresented populations. The Dread Machine, we do have a call right now for slush readers. So if you're looking for experience, we are looking for, we call them gatekeepers, but it's slush reading, first reading. And we are prioritizing applications from underrepresented populations, just given the demographic of our editorial team. But you can find that on the Dread Machine website.
Yes, and I've just posted this in the chat, but mermaidsmonthly.com. We're open until the 12th of June. We have our submissions guidelines on our site, and it links to the portal where you can submit. We will also be taking the applications for the next editorial team in the second half of June. So you can find all of that, all the details on all of that at mermaidsmonthly.com. And I also posted the link to the latest flash story that I posted on my Patreon by someone else. And my Twitter handle is @OMGJulia. And thank you so much to all of you for attending, and to Gabriella for moderating, for Marv for hosting. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, thanks to everyone as well. This has been cool. You can submit to Baffling June 1st to June 15th. That's at bafflingmag.com. And then we're doing 2 rounds of submissions for our 2023 novella series at Neon Hemlock. The first round is for BIPOC writers in June 5th to June 19th. And then there's a window for everybody in October. And those are both for the 2023 novellas.